Hey guys, my name is Rachel and welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, welcome to my channel. So in today's video, we are going to be discussing an extremely disturbing and heart-wrenching case of a 10-year-old little boy who just didn't have a chance at life from the very beginning. It's yet another one of those cases where the system totally failed yet another child. Despite warnings, despite knowing what was going on, the system just did absolutely nothing. I am just warning you now that the details in this case are extremely hard to hear, especially since they involve a child, and I know that can be even more sensitive for people, so I'm just letting you know now. This case will make you extremely angry after you hear all of the details of what happened to this poor little boy and what he had to go through and how he just received such a lack of justice. So just be ready for that. With that being said, let's just get right into today's case. Today, we are going to be talking about the devastating case of Jesse Wilson. Jesse Wilson was only 10 years old when he went missing from Buckeye, Arizona. Now, when Jesse was pretty young, I'm not exactly sure how old he was, but he was given up by his birth mother and adopted by a woman named Crystal Wilson. I couldn't really find a lot about his biological mother, why she gave him up, or if she had any contact with him throughout his life, but as far as I know, he didn't know who his birth mother was, and just the vibe I get from watching different interviews and things like that, I don't think she had any sort of contact with him after giving him up. Now, it seemed as if Jesse was in a very bad situation from the get-go. I will get into a lot more of the details in just a few minutes, but Jesse grew up with pretty much nothing. He had two adoptive brothers, but neither him or his brothers had any toys. They never got to eat, they were malnourished, and showed up to school looking dirty and unkept. Now, according to Crystal, Jesse's adoptive mother, Jesse had a habit of escaping his bedroom at night to go wandering around the neighborhood in the middle of the night. In April of 2016, just a few months before he went missing, Jesse apparently jumped from his second-story bedroom window in the middle of the night and just wandered several houses down the road and ended up at a neighbor's house. He was basically just standing there by himself, not letting anyone near him. These neighbors were obviously concerned, so they called the authorities. When they arrived, they saw that Jesse was already dressed in his school clothes, and he told them that he was just trying to get to school.
It's from this April after a neighbor finds Jesse in front of his home in the early morning hours. Now it's dark and grainy as cops question Jesse, asking why he ran away. Much of his responses are either hard to hear or possibly redacted, but there's this exchange as we hear from Jesse for the first time telling police why he's in school clothes so late.
I used to go to school in the middle of the night.
You used to go what?
To school in the middle of the night.
You used to go to school in the middle of the night? Do you still? Okay.
This was extremely bizarre, but they just brought Jesse back home and spoke with Crystal. Apparently, Crystal told police that Jesse had developmental issues and learning disabilities, and that's why he pretty much always leaves the house without permission. She told the officers that she did have multiple locks around the house to prevent him from getting out, and she even said that Jesse was on medications for these issues. Police said that they didn't notice any sign of abuse on Jesse, so they just returned him home and didn't really put much thought into it. Now, fast forward to the night of July 17th, 2016. Crystal basically said that the same thing happened. She said that sometime after around 9:30, when she put him to bed that night, Jesse must have sneaked out of his bedroom window and just wandered off. However, in the past, when he got out and wandered around, he never went too far and he was never out for too long. But this time, he never came back. In the early morning hours of July 18th, Crystal called the police to report Jesse missing. Immediately, investigators began their search. At first, they weren't sure whether foul play was involved since he had been said to have just wandered off that night by his mother, and he did have a recorded history of doing so. They immediately got the help of the FBI and used helicopters, sniffer dogs, and had tons of volunteers from his school, and just exhausted their efforts in searching his entire neighborhood and the surrounding areas. Again, at this point, they thought that he was probably just a runaway and couldn't have gotten very far just on feet. However, after days and weeks passed without any signs of coming any closer to finding Jesse, they started to realize that it was very likely that foul play was involved. But at this point, they weren't really looking at Crystal because she was cooperating and seemed to be desperately searching for her 10-year-old son. She went out on the media to ask for him to come back and really just seemed like a mourning mother.
I just miss your loving, caring, sweet ways. They can come to Bradley Academy. They can wear their yellow ribbons in support of bringing Jesse home.
This was until Crystal's records came out and they realized that she actually had quite the history of abusing and mistreating her children. According to court documents, Jesse and his 2 adoptive brothers were abused and neglected by Crystal from the time that they were all very young. Teachers at Jesse's school said that he often showed up to school with his shoes on the wrong feet, his hair looked messy, and his teeth weren't brushed. They also said that Jesse had always showed up to school hungry. They said that Jesse didn't get dinner at home, and when they would eat breakfast and lunch at the school, he would wipe the plate clean. Even the things that normal kids didn't even like, Jesse would still scarf them down. He would take extra snacks and jumped at every opportunity that he had to eat. He just seemed to be always so starving. It was also reported that, of course, Crystal would withhold food for punishment, and that's probably why he was always so hungry at school. She would lock him in his room for extended periods of time without even a bathroom break, forcing him to soil himself in his room. It even went as far as when investigators actually checked the fridge at home, it was literally empty besides bottles of hard liquor and wine. In 2011, an anonymous caller reported seeing not just Jesse, but him and 2 other 4-year-old boys looking extremely malnourished and had been strapped to their beds with harnesses. Investigators checked out the scene and they did see multiple harnesses on the beds, but Crystal just said that her children would leave in the middle of the night and then come back covered in mud the next morning. So that's why she had to tie them to their beds. She had no choice. But, I can't even imagine why her children would be so desperate to leave their home and be so afraid that they would just come back the next morning. But either way, despite seeing that she literally tied her children to their beds with harnesses, I guess the ropes were long enough. They said they were about 3 feet. They saw no marks on the children and no real signs of abuse. So they just left without incident and she received no punishment. The only thing I really saw that they did after they saw this was give her parental tips. I don't know, she might have taken a parental course, but other than that, they didn't actually do anything. And in my opinion, it doesn't take a very good mother or a good parent to know that you shouldn't strap your kids to their beds at night, but that's just me. Now, reports stated that Crystal seemed to be physically abusive towards her adoptive children as well. In 2013, investigators looked into an incident where they found Jesse with a 1-inch welt on his left cheek, and Jesse literally told them that Crystal hit him with a belt in the face. They also found that in Jesse's room, he only had a dresser and a mattress. Like, literally, that's it. The mattress didn't even have any sheets or blankets on it, and it was wrapped in plastic. No toys in the room, nothing else. But still, nothing seemed to be done for Jesse or his 2 adoptive brothers. As you can see, the very short life that Jesse lived was one of abuse and neglect. However, Jesse was not the only child that suffered at the hands of Crystal. Before moving to Arizona, Crystal actually lived in California and had 6 foster children. Apparently, according to Crystal, They all left her care because they were reunited with their families with no fuss. However, that is a giant lie. Apparently, all 6 children had been taken away from her after it was discovered that she was withholding food as punishment. Yet, after moving to Arizona, she was still able to legally adopt 3 more children and maintained her license as a foster parent. Apparently, on her record of previous history with other states, nothing about having the children taken away was listed, so Arizona didn't even know that this happened because no one seemed to have documented it. I'm not exactly sure how this entire situation happened, whether it was on the employee's fault who just didn't document it, or if they just didn't think it was important enough, or if there's certain laws saying that you can't give that information to another state. I don't know, but to me, it just seems like negligence. If anyone does know any information on those types of laws, please let us know in the comments below, because I honestly don't know why no one said anything about having 6 children taken away from her after she refused to feed them. But clearly, again, Jesse was in a bad situation from the very beginning, a situation that he should have never been able to be in the first place. He was in a home with a woman who never should have been able to adopt any more children, who should have never been given the opportunity to take care of children or have them in her household or even be around children. But either way, after finding out all of this sketchy information, of course, they started to look more at Crystal for being responsible for the disappearance. But other than a lengthy history of child abuse and neglect, they still didn't have a body. They didn't really have any evidence. They didn't even know whether he was alive or not. And again, there was nothing else that was directly pointing to her being responsible. Whether she abused him and a bunch of other children or not, that doesn't necessarily mean that in this specific instance, she was the one who was responsible for him disappearing. So let's fast forward 2 years. Police had still been extensively searching for Jesse. They never gave up. But on March 8th, 2018, remains were actually found in a field near the intersection of State Route 85 and Broadway Road in Arizona. These remains were pretty much fully decomposed into a skeleton, and they were scattered everywhere. The field was in a pretty remote area and was just surrounded by fields on the edge of Buckeye. At first, when they found these remains, they didn't know who these remains belonged to. They weren't even able to tell if they belonged to a child or an adult. They did more testing, ran more tests, and unfortunately found out that these remains actually did belong to 10-year-old Jesse Wilson. This was just such a shock and horror to the community and those around Jesse who loved him and truly did care about him. Now, these remains were found in their original search perimeters, but the area is prone to flooding, so when they went there to search the first time, the dogs didn't pick up on anything because the area was underwater. I also want to mention that the spot he was found was 6 miles away from his home. So that means if Jesse did walk all the way over there 6 miles away, he would have had to walk that entire distance in the dark without anyone seeing him or being noticed by anyone for him to end up all the way over there. Now, as you can imagine, having the remains sitting there for 2 years made it pretty difficult to come up with a cause of death. Again, he was pretty much decomposed into a skeleton and the remains were scattered, so they really had no idea what could have happened. So after sending the remains to the medical examiner, unfortunately, the cause of death was left at undetermined. She did say that there were multiple bone fractures, but that could have happened after death. She couldn't tell whether it was before death or post-mortem. However, Laura Falganiti, I'm sorry if I'm saying that name wrong, a forensic anthropologist, examined Jesse's remains and shed a little bit of light on the case and gave some general clues as to what could have happened and kind of gave just a little bit more insight. Basically, she said that if the bones were near the ground's surface, they would be bleached white from sun exposure. But if they were buried, they would absorb the color of the dirt and be a lot darker. She had also said that if they were in and out of water, so like, you know, when it was flooded, they were in water and then were exposed to the air when it was dry, that the bones would be warped and cracked in a similar way that wood deforms. Now, I don't know whether these bones looked like they were buried or not. I wish that I could find that. I wasn't sure, but I'm sure police know and hopefully are using that as a part of their investigation. Obviously, I'm thinking that if he did walk there and died of exposure, his remains wouldn't be buried, so the bones would be more bleached and maybe even more displaced from where he actually died because of the flooding, maybe, you know, accelerating decomposition and scattering the bones everywhere. However, if he were buried, that could indicate foul play. If his bones were darker and they absorbed the color of the dirt, then it probably wouldn't have moved as much when it flooded because they were underground. However, this assumption is not foolproof because it's going under the assumption that if foul play was involved, then they definitely would have buried him. But obviously that's not always true. We know that the remains were scattered, so that makes me lean more towards him not being buried. But that doesn't mean that he automatically walked there. He could have been dumped there by someone and not buried. We don't know that. So I don't really think that the bones can tell us definitively whether foul play was involved or not. And I think that you can make some assumptions based off of how they look. But again, you can't always just assume that if foul play was involved, then he was definitely buried. But either way, Buckeye police are saying that they are investigating his case as a homicide, which tells me that they must have much more reason to believe that foul play was involved and that he didn't just walk off. They'd also said that they are pretty confident that they will have this case solved, but they haven't publicly named any suspects. They did say, however, that it's not because they don't know who's responsible. So what I'm taking from this is that they know who is responsible, but they just don't have enough evidence yet to feel confident enough to follow through with a conviction. Now, a lot of you are probably thinking the same thing as me, and that is that Jesse's mother, Crystal, is responsible. During the entirety of the investigation, searching for the remains, all of that, Crystal went out on the media and asked for him to come home. She said that she won't be mad at him and she just misses him and just wants him to come back. But I'm not buying any of that, and I don't think anyone else is. Fortunately, the two other boys under Crystal's care were removed from the home shortly after Jesse's disappearance, and I just hope that they've been placed with parents who will actually feed them and care for them and give them the love and the affection that they deserve. I just hope that they were able to get out of this situation and be brought to a better home, not another home that's just going to abuse and neglect them. I also want to mention that Crystal did move away from Arizona and she now lives out of state, but I'm not sure exactly where. As of right now, this case does remain completely unsolved. I have seen in some theories that police don't think that Jesse's mother is involved. They said that there's no reason to believe that, and they in fact have information going the other way. But I've also seen other sources that allude to them definitely thinking that Jesse's mother is involved. So I'm not exactly sure where the investigation is right now. I'm not sure what's going on behind the scenes. I'm sure there is a lot of people working on his case right now, but I'm just not exactly sure where they're heading with it. So there are two main theories in this case, and I think that one theory is definitely more likely over the other one. Now, if we want to believe what Jesse's abusive and neglectful mother says, then the first theory is that Jesse just wandered off and succumbed to the elements. So we know that Jesse did have a history of wandering off, but he always did return home. But at the same time, I don't know if I believe that that specific night that he went missing, that he wandered off because she literally harnessed him to the bed every night, and by her own words, she made sure that he was locked up. She locked up the entire house to keep him from getting out. You're telling me that this specific night, she just happened to forget to tie him to his bed and lock up his window. On top of that, you want me to believe that this 10-year-old child just wandered 6 miles away from his home in the middle of the night without being seen by a single person. He was last seen at 9:30 p.m. that night, according to Crystal, so I guess we do just kind of have to take her word for that, and it could be wrong, but let's just assume that 9:30 was when he was last seen, so that means that he must have probably left the house around 9:30 to midnight, anywhere between that time frame. You have to assume that if he did leave around this time, and I will tell you my reason for saying that time in just a minute, but you have to assume that if he did leave around this time, that someone within the 6 miles would have still been awake to see him walking all by himself. It's possible that no one saw him if he was out between the hours of like 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. when pretty much no one's awake, but it takes a very long time to walk 6 miles, especially if you are a young child. And especially if you're just wandering, you're not going somewhere with a purpose. If you're just wandering around, it's gonna take a very long time to travel 6 entire miles. He would have had to have been outside and wandering for a very long time, and I just don't see how not a single person would have seen him this entire time. The reason I'm going with the time frame of him leaving the house between 9:30 p.m. and midnight is because, again, it takes such a long time to walk 6 miles. So you have to assume that he would have gotten to that field and somehow was just there, maybe passed out or something, before sunrise. Sunrise, especially in the summer, is around 6 or 7 a.m. So it would have taken, I'm assuming, at least an hour per mile to walk that far. Now that's just a rough estimate. It could have been faster, it could have been longer, but it would have taken him about 6 hours to get 6 miles away. Again, just assuming he was wandering, not running, just kind of going in different directions. You have to assume that it would have taken a very long time. So if he left at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. or 4 a.m., someone would have saw him that morning just wandering around because he still would have been walking by then. He wouldn't have gotten there before 6 a.m. He wouldn't have been able to walk 6 miles in 2 hours. So again, he would have had to have left between 9:30 and midnight. And again, someone would have been up and awake at that point within the 6 miles and see him walking around. I just highly doubt that no one would have saw him. Or even if we assume that he left around 2 or 3 or 4 a.m., someone would have saw him that morning. So I just don't think it's very possible that he would have walked 6 miles in the middle of the night without being seen by a single person. I know that's kind of a little bit of a tangent, but just to kind of make sense of it and kind of show you how insane and ridiculous this theory is, I just do not think that it's possible whatsoever. I think that the most obvious explanation here is that Crystal is responsible. She had a clear history of taking in children only to abuse and neglect them. Again, I don't really know much about Crystal or her past or anything like that besides abusing children, but I can imagine that the only reason someone would want to take in children only to not even feed them, not want to provide for them, is for some sort of benefit, monetary benefits, tax breaks, whatever. But that's what I assume she probably did. I don't think she had any ounce in her that wanted to care for all of these children. I will just never understand why she would choose to go out of her way to obtain the proper license, take in children, go through that entire process just to neglect them unless she had some sort of other monetary gain. I will also never understand why investigators and DCFS know exactly what is going on in these homes but just choose to do nothing. She had a very clear and extensive history of abusing and neglecting her children, and I think that it's absolutely insane to assume that anyone else is responsible for Jesse's death. What I think is probably what happened is that she was physically abusing Jesse. Something happened that resulted in his death, and she dumped his body in that remote field knowing that no one would find it for a very long time. I honestly don't even think that she buried him. Like I mentioned earlier about the remains either being buried or not, and the possibility of that indicating how he ended up there. If his remains were scattered, again, that points to him not being buried, which again, some could say was a sign of him just wandering there and ending up there. However, I don't think this woman cared a single bit about her children, and I just don't even think that she would have taken the time or risked being caught by burying him. I don't know if I believe that she intentionally killed Jesse. I am more leaning towards not intentionally killing Jesse, but more so that her abusive actions caused his life to end. Whether she starved him for too long and found him dead, which is very possible, or she physically abused him to the point of his injuries causing death. Either way, I think she is responsible, and I think it's very clear that she did not care whatsoever about him, his siblings, or any of the other children who have had the absolute disservice of being forced to live under the same household as her. Again, I will never understand why someone would go out of their way to obtain the proper licensing and take the time out of their life to get all of these children just to care so little about them. I probably think, again, that she had some sort of monetary gain involved, which is absolutely horrific that there are people out there that do this, but we know that there are people out there that just want these children, whether they're a foster parent or an adoptive parent, or whether they had their own children, they just want the monetary gain, and it's pretty awful that these people exist. Now, I also want to mention, of course, that the Child Protective Services system is just absolutely flawed. They don't take the proper steps to protect children, and there's so many cases that we hear of where a child very clearly was being abused and neglected, and they didn't do anything. They just left the child in the home with the abuser, not even thinking twice about it. This is one of those cases that got suggested to me that I debated covering for quite a while. I got multiple suggestions to do this case, but I just wasn't sure whether I wanted to cover it because it just made me so angry. The fact that, in my opinion, Crystal hurt her child so badly that he died, or neglected him so badly that he died, then was able to hide his body so well that they couldn't even determine a cause of death, just shows that she is literally being rewarded for being smart about her abuse and being smart about where she hid his body. I also think it is ridiculous that there aren't stiffer punishments for harming children or neglecting children. All of this information came out about her abusing her children, and I haven't seen anything about any jail time or any sort of punishment for this. All I've seen was that it was being used for their investigation, which is great, but why does it happen so that when this information comes out, she's not punished for it, or she wasn't punished for it to begin with? The most that I've ever seen happen is that she just had to take parent education classes, which, in my opinion, don't do anything, because you know when you're harming your child or starving them, you know that you shouldn't be doing that. You know that when you're hitting your child with a belt in their face, that you shouldn't be doing that. No parent education class is going to change a horrible, horrible person who can look their child in the eyes and still hurt them. Despite a very clear and lengthy history of abuse and neglect, she's been allowed to abuse and neglect even more children. So many children, possibly even to the point of one of them dying. And she is just out there living her life, probably adopting more children because she's in a new state. And we all know how that went for her last time. I just cannot believe how severely lacking our justice system is when it comes to protecting our most vulnerable and fragile people. Children should not die. Children should not be harmed. Children especially should not be harmed at the hands of their own parents, who are literally biologically made to care for and protect their children. We know that the parent is the very first person in a child's life that is responsible and protecting them. But there are just so many screwed up people in this world that we put in place yet another safeguard for children. But what happens time and time again? The structure that is in place to provide safety for our children fails children all the time. The very people that are in a child's life solely to protect and care for them are the ones that abuse them and fail them over and over and over again. It is completely unbelievable, and now all we can do is just hope that police are doing some good work behind the scenes and that we will see justice for Jesse in the coming years. So that is all I have for today's video. I know it was a rough one to hear, and I know I went on a couple of tangents, but I just imagine that you all are probably just as angry as I am after hearing this case. I know I'm not the only one that heard all about this disgusting woman and felt so much absolute hatred for her. Again, I just hope and pray that something is being done and she's not allowed to just live the rest of her life despite abusing so many children and possibly even killing one of them. But either way, that is all I have for today's video. If you like this kind of content, please make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for new true crime and mystery videos every single week. Also, don't forget to follow my Twitter and Instagram. Both will be linked in the description box below. Also, if you wish to help me support this channel, I did just make a Patreon, and that will be linked in the description box below. If you have any case suggestions, please make sure to email them to me at RachelShannonCases@gmail.com. Every video that I create have been suggestions from you guys, and I read every single case suggestion that I get, so please do not hesitate to send your suggestion over. With that, I hope you guys have a great week, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!